Napoleon Bonaparte conquered the armies of Austria and Prussia and Russia, but he was defeated by a cup of coffee. He thought he could command the economy, just like he commanded a cavalry charge, but he learned the hard way that you cannot issue orders to the laws of supply and demand. This is the story of how a caffeine headache brought down the greatest empire in modern history. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. When we think of the Napoleonic Wars, we think of cannons and muskets and cavalry charges. We see the smoke of the battlefield. But the real war, the war that actually decided the fate of the world, was fought in the warehouses and the custom houses and the breakfast tables of Europe. It was an economic war. And the weapon of mass destruction was not a cannonball, it was a coffee bean. To understand why this happened, we have to go back to the year 1806. Napoleon was the master of Europe. He had crushed the Austrians at Austerlitz. He had annihilated the Prussians at Jena. His armies marched through Berlin and Vienna. On land, he was invincible. But across the English Channel, there was a problem: Great Britain. Britain was the one enemy Napoleon could not reach. The British Royal Navy controlled the oceans with an iron grip. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Admiral Nelson had destroyed the French fleet. Napoleon was like a tiger who ruled the land, staring at a shark who ruled the sea. The tiger cannot swim and the shark cannot walk. It was a stalemate. Napoleon knew he could not invade England. He had no ships. So he decided to destroy them financially. He looked at the British economy and he saw a vulnerability. Britain was a nation of shopkeepers. Their power came from trade. They made money by selling goods to Europe. If he could stop that trade, the British economy would collapse, the banks in London would fail, and the British government would be forced to sue for peace. So in November 1806, sitting in the conquered capital of Berlin, Napoleon signed one of the most important documents in history, the Berlin Decree. He declared a total blockade of the British Isles. He called it the Continental System. No ship coming from Britain or its colonies was allowed to enter any port in the French Empire or its allies. No British goods could be sold in Europe. Any British goods found on the continent were to be confiscated and burned. He told his allies in Russia and Germany and Italy that this was a holy war for the economic independence of Europe. He said they were going to bankrupt the British tyrants. On paper, it looked like a brilliant plan. It was the first example of modern economic sanctions. But Napoleon had made a fatal calculation error. He had forgotten about the consumer. He thought that trade was just numbers on a ledger. He didn't realize that trade was actually people living their lives. And by 1806, the people of Europe had developed some very specific addictions. For centuries, Europeans had lived on bread and beer and gruel. But in the 18th century, the world changed. The colonial trade brought new exotic goods that quickly became necessities: sugar, coffee, tea, tobacco, cotton, indigo for dyeing clothes. These were the colonial goods, and almost all of them came from the tropical colonies controlled by the British Navy. When Napoleon signed that decree, he wasn't just banning British ships. He was banning the morning ritual of every middle-class citizen in Europe. He was banning the sugar that went into their cakes. He was banning the coffee that woke them up. He was banning the tobacco that they smoked in the evening. At first, the people of Europe tried to be patriotic. They cheered the emperor. They said, "Yes, we will sacrifice for the glory of France." But then the withdrawal set in. The price of coffee skyrocketed. In Paris, the price of sugar rose by 400%. Cotton became so expensive that people couldn't afford new clothes. Napoleon told his scientists to find substitutes. He was the father of ersatz goods. He told them to make sugar out of beets. He told them to make coffee out of chicory and roasted acorns and burnt barley. Have you ever tasted coffee made from roasted acorns? It is disgusting. It is bitter and thin, and it gives you no energy because there is no caffeine. Imagine an entire continent suffering from caffeine withdrawal at the same time. The soldiers were grumpy, the workers were tired, the aristocrats were bored. The French people had tolerated the loss of their political liberty. They had tolerated the censorship of the press. They had even tolerated the conscription of their sons into the army. But they would not tolerate the loss of their coffee. This created a massive gap between the law and the reality. The law said British goods were illegal. The reality was that everyone wanted them. And where there is demand, the market will provide supply. The Continental System created the golden age of the smuggler. Before this, smuggling was a small-time business for criminals. Now it became the biggest industry in Europe. It turned respectable merchants into crime lords. It turned fishermen into blockade runners. It turned the entire population into accomplices. The center of this criminal empire was a tiny island called Heligoland. It is a small rock in the North Sea off the coast of Germany. The British seized it and turned it into a massive warehouse. They piled it high with mountains of coffee and sugar and tobacco. Hundreds of small boats would row out from the mainland at night. They would load up with goods and row back to secret coves in Germany and Holland and France. The smugglers were incredibly creative. They didn't just hide goods in wagons. They developed systems that would make a modern drug cartel jealous. They used funeral processions. They would fill a coffin with sugar and coffee beans and march solemnly through the city gates, weeping for their imaginary dead relative. The French customs guards would take off their hats out of respect, and the smugglers would walk right past them. They used women. Under the fashion of the Empire-style dresses, women could hide bags of coffee and rolls of tobacco. It was said that a woman could carry 20 pounds of sugar under her skirt and still walk elegantly. But the most famous method was the dog smugglers. On the border between France and Belgium, the smugglers trained armies of dogs. They would take the dogs to the French side and starve them. Then they would take them to the Belgian side where the British goods were waiting and feed them massive meals. Then they would load the dogs with small backpacks filled with coffee and tobacco. At night, they would release the starving dogs on the French side. The dogs would sprint across the border to get to the food on the other side. The French customs officials tried to stop them. Napoleon actually issued orders to shoot any dog seen moving near the border. There were nights where the French army was literally at war with a pack of dogs carrying coffee beans. This sounds funny to us today, but it was a sign of a deep rot. The state was losing control. Napoleon responded with fury. He was a control freak. He couldn't stand the idea that people were disobeying him. So he turned France into a police state of customs inspectors. He hired thousands of new armed guards called the douaniers. They were hated more than the foreign enemy. They had the right to enter any home, to search any warehouse, to stop any traveler. They became corrupt almost immediately. If you paid the guard a bribe, he would look the other way. If you didn't, he would burn your house down. This corruption ate away at the soul of the empire. The French people started to see the emperor not as a hero, but as a tyrant who wanted to make their lives miserable, and the hypocrisy was staggering. While Napoleon was ordering his soldiers to burn British cotton in the town squares, his own army was marching in uniforms made of British wool. The French textile industry couldn't produce enough quality cloth, so the army contractors secretly bought it from the British. When Napoleon invaded Russia, his soldiers were wearing coats made in Leeds and Manchester. Even the emperor's own household wasn't safe. Empress Josephine, Napoleon's wife, was a woman who loved luxury. She refused to wear the coarse French fabrics. She wanted fine British muslin, and she loved her sugar. The prefect of police had to report to Napoleon that his own wife was buying smuggled goods. Napoleon was furious, but what could he do? Arrest the empress. By 1810, the system was collapsing. The economy of Europe was in a depression because they couldn't export their own goods. The winemakers of Bordeaux were bankrupt because they couldn't sell wine to the British. The timber merchants of the Baltic were starving. Napoleon realized he was killing his own economy to hurt the enemy. So he did something cynical. He issued the Decree of St. Cloud in 1810. He created a system of licenses. He effectively said that trading with the enemy is punishable by death unless you buy a special piece of paper from me for a massive amount of money. He legalized the black market for the rich. If you were a wealthy French merchant and you paid the emperor a huge fee, you could import British goods. This destroyed the moral authority of the blockade. The common soldier looked at this and said, "Wait a minute. I'm supposed to die fighting the British, but the emperor is selling them licenses." It was a betrayal. It proved that the war wasn't about principle. It was about money. And the geopolitical consequences were even worse. The Continental System is what actually caused the military downfall of Napoleon. Look at the map. Why did Napoleon invade Portugal in 1807? Because Portugal refused to stop trading with Britain. That invasion led to the Peninsular War in Spain, which became the bleeding ulcer that drained the French army for years. Why did Napoleon invade Russia in 1812? We are often told it was about ego, but it was about economics. Tsar Alexander of Russia had signed the treaty to join the Continental System, but the Russian economy depended on selling timber and hemp and grain to Britain. Without that trade, the Russian ruble collapsed. The Russian nobility was going broke. The Tsar begged Napoleon to let them trade. Napoleon said no, the system must be total. So the Tsar ignored him. He opened the Russian ports to neutral ships which were just British ships in disguise. Napoleon invaded Russia to enforce a trade embargo. He marched 600,000 men to their deaths, not for territory, but to close a customs loophole. He sacrificed the Grand Army on the altar of the Continental System. And what did the British do during all of this? Did they collapse? No. They suffered, yes. There were riots in the British industrial cities, but they had the rest of the world. While Napoleon controlled Europe, Britain controlled the Americas, India, and Asia. They just pivoted their trade. They sold their goods to South America. They sold them to the United States, and they used their massive wealth to fund every enemy of Napoleon. The British gold that paid for the Austrian cannons and the Russian muskets came from the very trade that Napoleon was trying to stop. The irony is tragic. Napoleon wanted to bankrupt Britain. Instead, he bankrupted his own political capital. He turned the merchant class of Europe against him. These were the people who had originally supported the revolution. They wanted meritocracy and free trade. Napoleon gave them a stifling bureaucracy and economic ruin. When the Allies finally marched into Paris in 1814, they were not just greeted as liberators by the royalists, they were greeted as liberators by the shopkeepers. One of the first things the provisional government did when Napoleon was exiled was to abolish the Continental System. The ports were thrown open. There are accounts of what happened next. British ships flooded into the harbors of Hamburg and Amsterdam and Bordeaux. They were carrying coffee, mountains of coffee. The price of sugar dropped by 80% overnight. The people of Europe brewed their first real cup of coffee in years. The smell of roasting beans filled the streets. For the average person, that smell was the smell of freedom. The lesson of the coffee war is a lesson that echoes through history to the present day. We see leaders today who think they can use economic sanctions to redesign the world. They think they can cut off the flow of oil or microchips or capital and force other nations to kneel. And sometimes it works on small countries. But when you try to fight the fundamental laws of economics, you usually lose. Markets are like water. You can build a dam, you can build a wall. But if there is a crack, the water will find it. If there is a demand, the supply will find a way. Napoleon was a genius of the battlefield. He understood terrain and morale and artillery, but he didn't understand the kitchen table. He didn't understand that to the average citizen, the price of bread and the availability of coffee matters more than the glory of the empire. He thought he could substitute beet sugar for cane sugar and nobody would care. But they did care. He forced the people to choose between him and their lifestyle. And they chose their lifestyle. When we look at the collapse of the French Empire, we shouldn't just look at the snow in Russia or the mud at Waterloo. We should look at the empty coffee cups on the tables of Paris. We should look at the smugglers running through the moonlight with backpacks full of tobacco. They were the foot soldiers who really defeated the emperor. The quiet decay of the Napoleonic Empire started the moment he signed the Berlin Decree. He created a crime that everyone wanted to commit. He made the state the enemy of the ordinary pleasure, and no government, no matter how powerful, can survive that for long. The next time you drink your morning coffee, take a moment to smell the aroma. It is a powerful thing, powerful enough to bring down a tyranny. Napoleon learned that you can conquer a capital city with bayonets, but you cannot conquer a market with a decree. This is Tom from the Collapsed Log. History is a series of lessons that we usually refuse to learn, and the bill for our ignorance always comes due.